If you show your vaccination card, you get a free donut.
Oh, Krispy Kreme. Yeah,
Thank you.
that.
That's what I thought I was searching for. Krispy Kreme. Hi, Mike.
Michael, you're muted, but nice to see you anyway. It's, yeah,
Hello there. Let me test my audio again. It was echoing a minute ago. Okay, I don't hear it now.
We have contractors on our roof, so I'm going to go ahead and use earbuds.
You installing solar, Tony?
No, we're just repapering after 40 years. But we will get there. That's one of our next projects, Dave.
Yeah, we're looking at that same issue here.
Chair
Yeah,
West, we are
we'll
ready
get there.
whenever you are.
well, Keely, do we have, looks like we have all the board members. Are we waiting on anyone?
No, we are ready when you are.
All right, it is 1:30. We will call to order the, what is the March 24, 2001 meeting of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Board of Directors. I ask everyone to please rise where you are and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And roll call, please.
Chair West,
Yes.
Director Ramirez,
I'm here.
Director Mobley,
Here.
Director Tremblay,
Here.
Director Borchard.
Here.
All right, thank you. Then moving on to an agenda review. Any changes to the agenda?
No changes, Chair.
Thank you. We'll move next to public comment. This is an opportunity for anyone wishing to address the board on matters not otherwise on today's agenda to raise your hand and be recognized by the clerk of the board.
None seen, Chair.
Okay. Then moving on to board member comments. Any of the board members have any comments they wish to make before we move on to the rest of the agenda? No, so hearing none, then we have one item on the consent agenda, the minutes from the prior meeting. Unless someone has a question, a comment, or a change, the chair will entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Move
Tremblay
to approve.
move. Tremblay second.
And a roll call, please.
Chair West,
Yes.
Director Ramirez, Director Ramirez, your microphone is on mute. Director Mobley,
Muted.
Yes.
Director Tremblay,
Yes.
Director Borchard.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's move on then to item number 2, the John K. Flynn Groundwater Stewardship Award.
Chair West, board members, this item on the agenda, the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency annually nominates and grants an award, the John K. Flynn Groundwater Stewardship Award. And this award was meant to recognize an individual or entity that contributed the most by protecting groundwater, enhancing water quality, or assisting the agency in efforts to manage water resources in this area of Ventura County. This item is to select a 2-member agency board member ad hoc committee to meet via teleconference to consider nominees and select a recipient for the 2021 year.
Thank you. Any volunteers for the committee? Usually it's done in a simple single phone call. Doesn't usually take very long.
I volunteer. Carmen.
Thank you, Carmen. Anyone else?
I'll volunteer.
Thank you, Michael. All right. Unless somebody has got some objection that I'm not likely to even hear, the committee then will be Director Ramirez and Director Mobley. And Keely will be in touch to coordinate that phone call. All right, let's move on then to item number 3, which is a 2021 budget review.
Chair West, members of the board, for the record, Kim Loeb, Fox Canyon staff. And so this is an update on the actual revenue and expenses through February compared to the budget. And I'm going to share my screen here because you know I have a PowerPoint. All right, let's see. Okay, so you should be seeing that now. Okay, so just to refresh your board's understanding of how the budget is organized, it's organized into 2 sets of accounts: the designated accounts, which are funds that are specifically designated and set aside by your board for expenditures only as directed by your board. And there are 3 accounts. There's the GEMS account, which is a reserve account for legal actions and proceedings. There's the surcharges account, which is where all surcharge revenue is collected for extractions over allocations. And then there is a $1 million operating reserve account as set by your board. Then there's the operating account. That's our normal operational expenses. That account has 4 revenue streams in general: pump charges, groundwater sustainability fees, civil penalties, and interest on unpaid penalties for failures for violations of agency ordinance code, and then grant funds as we obtain them. Then there are the major operating expenses in the operating account are the Public Works Agency charges. Those are the charges from the Public Works Agency for staffing and administering the agency. Legal services fees, these are fees for the normal business of Fox Canyon for the most part. County General Services Agency expenses. These are the expenses for using the boardroom, the county AV staff for the audio visual, for our printing of our board packets and other things, and all our mail and postage goes through the GSA. FCGMA Online is our data management system. And so that's the expenses for the maintenance of that system. And then this is our second year where we have GSP annual report expenses for the 3 basins as required by the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Those reports are in preparation now. Your board awarded the contract. GSP implementation charges, and then the AMI implementation. Those are just sort of a summary of some of the principal expenses. So the operating account is projected to have a year-end balance of about $3.3 million. That, revenue. Year-end revenue of $3.3 million. That includes about an $8,000 $800,055 sustainable groundwater management planning grant that we received from the Department of Water Resources to help reimburse our groundwater sustainability plan expenses. The projected revenue is about 70,000 less than what was projected in the budget. And that's largely due to a smaller follow-on grant from the Nature Conservancy Natural Resource Conservation Service grant for the water market AMI implementation. We had lower revenue needs or expenditures needs for that, and the grant was less. And then projected interest revenue is significantly less than what had been budgeted. Expenses at year end are projected about $2.5 million. That's about 317,000 less than budget, and principally because our planning amounts for GSP implementation and working towards a new data management system. Those expenses were less than budget, but those will translate into the next year. The current projection is for a year-end balance of $886,162, and that's about $355,000 more than budgeted. The designated GEMS account, which we talked about when I opened, is the reserve fund for legal actions and proceedings, including special counsel expenses for litigation that we're involved in. When the budget was adopted, the GEMS account had no current funding mechanism until your board adopted Resolution 2020-05 in October of 2020. And that implemented a $20 per acre foot fee effective the first of this year. And because we collect pumping fee revenue in arrears, the first revenue from that new fee will be received in the fourth quarter of this fiscal year in May timeframe for the first 3 months as we transition to the new water year pumping. So it'll be for January through March. Just to refresh your board's memory, when that fee was adopted, there was a recognition by your board that the GEMS account balance would be in deficit until fiscal year 23-24, at which time it's projected to come back into the black. The year-end expenses against the GEMS are projected about a little less than 1.7 million, and the year-end fund deficit is projected at about 1.2 million. This is the summary table that was in the packet, and it shows the 4 accounts, the 3 designated accounts, and the operating fund. And from the left to the right shows the last year's year-end actuals, in gray the adopted budget. The next column are the expenses and revenue, or the balance as of February last month. Then in the turquoise are the projected year-end balances, and then the 2 right-hand columns are the next year and the following year projected planning year budgets. So that ends my prepared walkthrough of the budget to date. We are getting ready to start work on next fiscal year's budget and work plan. And there is a fiscal committee meeting scheduled on May 11th for the budget planning work session. And so staff at this point recommends your board receive and file this report, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Kim. Are there any questions or comments from the board before we entertain the same from the public?
I have one, Chair West.
Please.
Kim, I see the designated surcharge account increases year by year as we look forward. At one point, we had thought that those surcharges would begin to tail off and we wouldn't see that continued increase. Do you have an explanation for that?
Director Borchard, I'm not sure staff had that same understanding that surcharges would level off. Certainly, there is, if people are able to operate within their their extraction allocation, then there won't be surcharges, but there are at least a couple operators who seem to always operate over that, and they seem to look at that as a cost of business. So I did not have that expectation that that would level off.
If I might add to that, this is Jeff Pratt for the record. You may be thinking of the comments made when your board suspended collection of penalties for a year. So we'll definitely see it go down over the next year. I think, and a part of the reason for the continued increase, just the dry years, people have been pumping more than they usually do.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. That's a good clarification on that. We have not adjusted our projection at this point for next year based on that action your board took.
Any other questions or comments from the board? Julian, let me ask them and open it up to the public. If anyone has any questions or comments, please raise your hand to be recognized.
Mr. Perello?
Yes, thank you very much. Two questions. I appreciated the comment that Mr. Borchard asked in the response, but with respect to the answer and response that Mr. Borchard got, would not there be something in the minutes that reflect that answer? That's my first question.
I'll take that one. There may not be anything in the minutes, but there certainly would be something in the video record we could refer you to.
Okay. And I could share it with Mr. Borchard and myself. I appreciate that. The second question I have is with respect to the presentation, the amounts of funds that were spent from outside counsel, has it been a decision of a specific policy? Who will direct outside counsel? Is it county counsel? Is it the board, or is it staff? The reason I asked this question, that outside counsel had gotten extremely expensive, and that had been one of the reasons for the questions. Thank you. Those are my questions. And I would like to thank Francis and Christine for helping me to get into this meeting. Thank you very much. You got a good staff.
Thank you.
Francis and
I
Christine.
think the short answer to the question is, depending upon the issue and the circumstance, all three. Indeed, independent counsel works directly with county counsel, and their work is most immediately supervised on a day-to-day basis by county counsel, and on a regular basis by the board as well. And as far as the billing is concerned, I know staff goes through the billing regularly and with a fine-tooth comb, and we've discussed some of those issues with predecessor counsel in the past. So it is monitored carefully and will continue to be.
No other
Any
comments
other
seen.
questions? Whoops.
No other comments seen, Chair.
Okay. This is a receive and file request, so I guess we need a motion to receive and file.
I would make that motion.
And a second. And a roll call?
Chair West.
Yes.
Director Ramirez.
Yes.
Director Mobley,
Yes.
Director Tremblay,
Yes.
Director Borchard.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to item number 4, the feasibility of purchasing imported in lieu replacement water.
Good afternoon, Chair West, board members. For the record, my name is Jeff Pratt, staff to the GMA. I've got a brief presentation for you on this item. As you know, when your board became a GSA and adopted a GSP, it became possible for you to establish replenishment fees. As you also know, that your board has directed us to look at the details of how that will happen vis-a-vis the Prop 26 and Prop 218. That work is underway. Right now, there appears to be a discussion going on in Las Posas Valley about the feasibility of purchasing the groundwater that's pumped by the M&I suppliers. That would be Cayegas, Waterworks District 19, Waterworks District 1, and Crestwood currently, and providing them with by the purchase with replenishment fees, state water instead. There appears to be a lot of interest in that. But there are a lot of details that would have to be worked out. Basin-wide, vis-a-vis West Las Posas versus East Las Posas, what the price would be paid for the water, when and how it would be paid for, or under what circumstances the board would approve authorizes its use. So on and so forth. So there are enough issues that before we proceeded any further, we wanted your board's direction on this, and we felt that we should recommend to you that your board direct the operations committee to review this matter in some detail and get back to you with the report. That concludes my verbal remarks. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. The genesis of this goes back, I guess this idea has been around for a while. I recently had some conversations with several different parties in order to see whether or not there'd be a means of purchasing, essentially of purchasing the allocation dedicated to some of the M&I interests or those interests who have access to state water, to buy back their allocation for the benefit of the ag community out there on an annual or a biannual basis, on an as needed basis, because interestingly enough, the delta between the current projections for sustainable yield and production demand is about 12 or 13%, which is about equal to the allocations held by those who've got access to state water. When I raised that subject with some of those entities, they were 100% in support of the concept, very willing to go down that road and see if it was feasible in order to make that water available to the ag community out there, which would essentially mean that there'd never be a need for any cutbacks because the supply would be available to meet demand, if this worked, making the basin instantly sustainable, assuming it was all implemented immediately as opposed to over time. And those are some of the things that I think I was hoping the operations committee would take up. By the way, in addition to those contractors or those stakeholders who've got access to state water, I also had conversations with Cayegas, and they had a great deal of interest and some plans that could make a great deal of additional supply available out in that basin. And I don't want to speak for them, but there was a lot of interest and it seemed to be an opportunity there. So we haven't gotten there yet, but again, I think as Jeff proposed, I think it'd be a great idea to have these issues come to the operations committee, get sorted out with stakeholders, and discussed in the operations committee, and then have the operations committee come back with a recommendation at some point.
Chair West, I might add
Yeah.
that I've talked to both the Waterworks districts and Cayegas, and they both are extremely interested.
Yeah, one of the nice things about if this kind of thing could work, is that it makes a specific supply available in a specific amount at a specific price without really much in the way of new infrastructure or construction costs or delay, and without having to worry about, gee, how much yield is a project actually going to produce? So, I mean, it's got a lot to recommend it if it can work.
Chair, I'm all for the operations committee to look at this, but I'm a little leery. I mean, if it's going to be table A prices for state water, that is maybe on a short-term basis that would work, but long-term basis, boy, that better be a very small percentage of your overall water budget, because table A prices are not sustainable economically for any crops that we grow. But I'd be happy to look at it.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
that's a very profound comment from Member Mobley, because we know that water is getting scarce and getting, at least at this point, scarcer and more expensive. So really interested in the cost. How would it be valued in terms of to the users, et cetera, et cetera. So looking forward to that discussion.
Any other comments from the board before we open it up to the public? We'll come back to the board after we've heard any comments the public may have. Why don't we at this time ask any members who are out there in the audience to raise their hands if they have any questions or comments on the subject?
Mr. McGuire?
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, Neil, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. I sent in a chat comment too, because I wasn't sure how much time I was going to have. My comment for now is, I think in general, this is a good idea to look at with all the reservations that have been stated already. I'd ask that when you take a look at the program, that you look at using imported water for on an in lieu basis for all types of users, or at least more than just the M&I. There are mutual water companies that primarily serve agricultural customers that do currently have access to the imported water, and they might also benefit from this approach. They have taken imported water in the past, for example, for blending purposes. So I think we would want to, at least for now, take a broader approach and see what that would look like. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Neil. And by the way, I agree. I contacted those mutuals that I was aware of that had access to state water. If you've got access to a list or can send me an email with some others to contact, happy to reach out and explain in a little more detail some of the discussions that have happened, and invite them to participate in discussions with the operations committee.
Thank you for that invitation, and I'll take you up on it.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Henry, I'm assuming it might be Mr. Gromlich.
Henry, if that's you on there, you're muted. Okay.
Yes, this is Henry Gromlich with Cayegas. And thank you, Chair West and board and staff for considering this. I just wanted to comment, there's a little bit of confusion on the nomenclature between state water project water and water delivered by Cayegas, which is sourced primarily through MET. And these are details that we don't have to burden this discussion with, but Cayegas stands ready to help steer you through some of the institutional intricacies of this, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Henry. I've already had a bunch of those conversations with Tony Goff, and it didn't seem to me that there were any hurdles we couldn't clear.
Excellent.
None other seen,
Any other
Chair.
hands raised?
None other seen, Chair.
It looks like there's a phone number up on my screen. I don't know if that person had a question or not.
And I can't tell because that number's muted. In any event, let me turn back to the board then. Any further questions or comments? Any objections to referring this to the Operations Committee?
I have a question, an additional question.
Sure.
Okay, and that's basically, what is the timeline, anticipated timeline for this matter?
Oh, I haven't heard one yet. I guess that's a question that'll be asked to the Operations Committee.
So nothing's looming on us immediately.
No, we're talking about discussing the feasibility of whether or not this could work and under what circumstances.
Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Yeah, I think this is a worthwhile effort, so I'd make a motion to direct the board's operation committee to explore the feasibility of purchasing imported in lieu replenishment water in the Las Posas Valley Basin.
Is there a second?
I would make that second and just add that, yeah, anything we can do to enhance additional supply in any of these basins is at least worth looking at.
All right. And we have a motion and a second. I guess we need a roll call.
Chair West,
Yes.
Director Ramirez,
Yes.
Director Mobley,
Yes.
Director Tremblay,
Yes.
Director Borchard.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's move on to item number 5, an ordinance to amend the ordinance to establish an allocation system for the Oxnard Pleasant Valley Basins.
Good afternoon, Chair West, members of the board. Again, for the record, Kim Loeb, Fox Canyon staff. Share my screen here. All right. So just as a brief history, your board adopted the ordinance, the new allocation orders for the OPV basins back in October of 2019, became effective October 1st of last year. And the ordinance notes the board's and the agency's intent to move from a wellhead-based to a land-based allocation system in the OPV basins. And it sets out additional reporting requirements to help provide the information that will be necessary to facilitate that transition. Including on mutual water companies and other water purveyors that purvey water for agricultural purposes. There are 15 what we refer to as grandfathered water purveyors that are identified by resolution as having existed and exported water outside of the agency's boundary since before the agency was formed. It recognizes that these grandfathered water purveyors may continue to export groundwater outside the agency boundary, but it requires that they are subject to the agency's ordinances and regulations governing groundwater extractions and reporting. So a purveyor, Alta Mutual Water Company, who is one of these grandfathered purveyors, contacted the agency and requested to be exempted from the reporting for those deliveries outside of the agency boundary and the basins for the specific parcel by parcel reporting that we're requiring within the basins. Just as an FYI or remembrance, that these are the 15 grandfathered water purveyors. The bold ones are the ones that are in Oxnard and Pleasant Valley. The others are in Las Posas Valley. And this change really only affects those that provide water for agricultural purposes. So the proposed changes are that those mutual water companies, special districts, or municipalities that supply groundwater or in-lieu water for deliveries outside of the basins or the agency boundary, that they no longer be required for those deliveries outside to provide the location identifier of each agricultural turnout meter, the monthly water deliveries and meter readings from each agricultural turnout, and the customer name associated with each parcel. They would be allowed to aggregate that reporting. And it requires monthly reporting of the water delivered areas outside of the basin. And again, it doesn't affect the M&I water purveyors because they already are only required to aggregate that reporting. This is a red line of what the changes in the proposed ordinance would modify within the Article 2 of the ordinance. And it makes these modifications to Section 7.2, which addresses reporting by water purveyors supplying water for agricultural purposes, and again, just changes for 7.2.2 and 7.2.3 that additional information would only be required for deliveries within the agency boundary or the basins. Adds 2.4 to aggregate those monthly deliveries outside of the basins or the agency boundary. And then adds language there on 7.2.5 for aggregating that information. And then once again, 7.2.6, it only requires the customer name associated with each parcel for those basins located within the basins or agency boundary, because we only need that information for moving to the land-based allocations within the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins. So at this point, staff recommends that you receive and file this presentation, conduct a public hearing. This has been noticed as required. Consider adoption of the ordinance and find that the ordinance is exempt from these CEQA sections that are also cited in the staff report.
Thank you, Kim. Let me ask, are any questions or comments from the board before we convene the public hearing? Hearing none, we'll go ahead then and convene.
One question. Kim, you've described the ordinance changes. The reasoning for this is what?
Director Borchert, the reasoning is because we are asking for specific information of deliveries of water for agricultural water purveyors to the individual parcels from the turnouts. Alta Mutual Water Company contacted us, said, well, do you really need this for those parcels that are outside of the agency boundary and the basins, because they felt it would incur them additional expense for surveying their turnouts and some of the reporting. And so on review, staff felt that this information for those deliveries outside of the basins or the boundary really aren't necessary to be collected for the moving within the basins to a land-based allocation system, and felt that it could be aggregated.
Okay, thank you.
All right, at this point, we will convene the public hearing and invite members of the public to raise their hand and be recognized if they have any questions or comments with respect to the amendment to the ordinance.
Mr. Bondi?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, Brian, thank you.
Thank you. I'm speaking today on behalf of Alta Mutual. I want to thank staff for bringing this item. I just want to comment on the reasoning for this, Director Borchard's question. Certainly cost is one consideration, but probably not our primary consideration. Alta is a private mutual water company that operates according to bylaws incorporated in the state. And in the case of Alta, its shares are not appurtenant to land. So going down the path of trying to allocate to land, particularly outside of the GSA's boundaries within a mutual that has shares that float and are not appurtenant to land, is very problematic. And so the burden of collecting this data that would ultimately be used to try and do something that would not work in our mutual water company was something that we felt would not be a necessary expense. And that's really the main reason for this. I'd be happy to answer any questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Mr. Perello.
Thank you. Just a clarification for me, please. The water that is being moved off-site is being extracted from the basin that this organization oversees. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
And with that extraction, even if it is not going for M&I or Municipal, is it being sold by those agencies that are extracting it? That's a question.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that. I might assume so, but I really don't know.
Because the concern that I would have is just as a private citizen, if we have beneficial acts and payments required of those that sit over the basin, and you're benefiting people that are outside of the basin with a product that you have, the overlying bodies are paying to maintain, protect, and address, wouldn't there be need of fairness in this? Because it would seem that specifically, I noticed one of them is directly next, I think it surrounds the Saticoy spreading grounds. If those waters are being shipped off-site to an area for agricultural purposes or other purposes, would not there be some need for a consideration of fairness? And is this the best and most fair along the lines of what's good for one is good for another?
Well, Bert, let me take a stab at it. Generally speaking, the ordinances of the agency don't allow for stakeholders to use water outside the boundaries of the agency. These particular stakeholders pre-existed the agency, and the relationships and the water use pre-existed the agency, including some of those that exist outside the jurisdictional boundaries of the agency. And that's why that's why they're able, I believe, to deliver water outside the jurisdiction of the agency, simply because they pre-existed the agency. Is that right, Kim?
Chair West, yes, that's correct. And I'd also inform Mr. Perello that all these grandfathered water purveyors, they are subject to extraction allocations, any water extracted within the basins, and they pay the full extraction fees, including sustainability fees for that water extracted.
Chair, may I ask a follow-up?
Please.
Are there the same manners of metering and the requirements of metering the wells for these organizations that would be providing water off-site as there are for the extractors over this aquifer?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
No, we're in the hearing, but I have a question at the appropriate time.
We'll come back to the board once we any other questions or
Mr.
comments from the
Bondi.
public?
Can you hear me again? This
Yes,
is Brian
Brian.
Bondi. I just wanted to respond to Mr. Perella's question. I can't speak for all of the grandfathered purveyors, but in the case of Alta Mutual, we were incorporated in 1912. We've been around for a long time, and we have to meet all the same requirements of everybody else who's pumping from the basin, including paying fees to the agency and to United Water Conservation District for their replenishment operations. So we're in this together with everybody else. The matter that's before the board today is simply a question of what's the appropriate granularity of reporting the distribution and use of water for those who are delivering it outside the agency. And in our particular case, our concern again is that our shares are not appurtenant to the land. So there's not a clear pathway to a land-based allocation within our service area. Thank you.
No other comments seen, Chair.
Let me then turn it back to the board. Any questions or comments? Carmen, I think you had some. Yes.
Yes, and I'd like to ask our council to weigh in on the question posed by Mr. Perella. Mr. Boada.
Yes, good afternoon, board. Yes, and I think Mr. Bondi correctly identified the distinction between what's being proposed here and the concern raised by Mr. Perella. This is strictly a matter of the level of reporting requirements to be imposed on those pumpers which are identified as grandfathered purveyors. And with respect to the board's decision to allow exports, that was a policy decision made by this agency over 20 years ago, and is not impacted by this proposed ordinance.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the board? If there are none, the chair will entertain a motion to consider adoption of the ordinance and to include a finding that the ordinance is exempt from a CEQA pursuant to Water Code 10728.6 as outlined in the board packet.
So moved.
Thank you. And a second. Director Mobley seconds, and a roll call.
Chair West.
Yes.
Director Ramirez.
Yes.
Director Mobley.
Yes.
Director Tremblay.
Yes.
Director Borchard.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Moving on to item number 6, an update on the processing of applications for variances.
Chair West, members of the board, Kim Loeb again. Share my screen here. This is an update on the variances applications received for the Oxnard Pleasant Valley Basins. There we go. So just briefly, your board adopted that ordinance as we just talked in the previous item back in October of 2019. That ordinance has a section, Article 11, that sets out specific standards that must be met before a variance can be issued by the executive officer. And the burden of proof of meeting those 5 standards is on the applicant. And those are that there's special circumstances or exceptional characteristics for that applicant don't apply to, in general, to other operators or owners in the basin. The granting the variance will not convey a special privilege. The denial of the variance will result in practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships. That granting of the variance will not be inconsistent with the Groundwater Sustainability Plans, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or other regulations or ordinances, or the ability of the agency to protect and improve the quality and quantity of water. and it will not substantially impede the agency's ability to sustainably achieve or to achieve sustainable groundwater management. Subsequent to adoption of the ordinance, your board adopted Resolution 2020-03 after several study sessions at the Executive Committee to establish policies and procedures for granting variance from initial allocations under the ordinance under certain conditions. One was for variances to bring non-reported extractions into compliance, to be able to include those unreported extractions in the base period allocation. Those were divided into two categories. One is where 5 or more years or more than half of those extractions over the base period were reported to the agency. The resolution adopts a reduced civil penalty schedule, and there's a formula for estimating the extractions if other info on those extractions is not available. And then for those who reported less than 5 years or less than half that base period, they would be subject to the full $50 a day civil penalty, and burden of proof is upon that applicant to provide evidence that of those extractions during the base period. And then lastly, the ordinance or the resolution identifies what was called other variance requests, essentially new water requests. And the resolution establishes that those requests need to go to a variance review committee made up of other pumpers in the basin, and that the board would be the one to grant or to hear those variance requests. So the agency received requests for variance from 66 COM codes or accounts representing about 130 wells. Staff has conducted extensive analysis of the submitted applications. Some of them are complex, many were incomplete. Some were difficult to understand what the applicant exactly was requesting. The majority required submittal of additional supporting documents and information. The agency sent out letters to all the applicants requesting clarifications and additional documents and information as needed to complete the processing of those applications. So in the staff report, you'll see a table that divides the applications into basically different variance type buckets. We talked briefly about a couple of those in discussion of 2020-03 a moment ago, but the first bucket are what we would call routine variance requests, and these are requests, the kind of requests that Article 11 of the ordinance had expected, and these are for operators that may have had atypical extractions during the base period, for things like a pump was down for one or more reporting periods, or the land was fallowed, or was not using water as it normally would because they're converting to organic or other reasons like that. We received requests from 8 COM codes representing 26 wells for about 991 acre feet of additional allocation requested. For non-reporters, for those who reported 5 or more years to the agency, we request for 22 COM codes representing representing 27 wells, and those with less than 5 years reported from 7 COM codes with 8 wells. And it should be noted that confirmed non-reported extractions in general are additive to the basin sustainable yield. In practice, it does depend on where the extractions are occurring, but those extractions were occurring As they're identified, they will go into future modeling efforts, and the basin was supporting them. Unlike the next category of other variance requests, and there's basically two types here. There's a request due to change crop or land use, and there are 15 COM codes requesting variance there for 20 wells and approximately 2,600 acre-feet of additional allocation requested. And then by far the biggest request are for those applicants that are requesting to have a groundwater extraction allocation for water that has been supplied by a purveyor. And there are 30 COM codes with 53 wells requesting approximately 21,229 acre-feet of additional allocation. It should be noted that the GSPs estimate the sustainable yield of the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins at 50,600 acre-feet. And so these requests are almost for 50% of the sustainable yield of the basin. And if granted, they would correspondingly come out of the allocations of other pumpers in the basins. And per the resolution adopted by your board, they have to be reviewed by the Variance Review Committee for that reason, and then the board would consider those requests. So here's the table that was in the staff report. It's just formatted to fit here, and it shows each of these categories, and it breaks them into the usage types of ag, M&I, and domestic for each of these types of requests. It should be noted that of the ag requests, I'll go back here, for the agricultural operators requesting allocation for pumping for water that's been supplied by a water purveyor, there's a total of about 9,152 acre-feet requested. And all but one of those are requesting allocation for water that's been supplied by United Pumping Trough Pipeline or Pleasant Valley County Water District's pipeline. We have one large request from a city, M&I, that represents over 99% of this 12,000 acre-feet requested, and that is to have allocation for water that has been supplied by Cayegas Municipal Water District, the imported water. But of those that ag operators are asking for allocation for PTP or PV pipeline water, all but one are asking for that. And it should be noted that continuing, in fact, expanding water supplies through pipeline systems is critical to achieving sustainable management of the basins. In fact, that's the reason why the pumping trough pipeline was constructed, was a mitigation effort for seawater intrusion. And some of those applicants expressed concern that they would have no allocation to pump in the event of an outage on or an interruption on either pipeline. And staff has had some initial conversations with United and Pleasant Valley County Water District staff about developing a process where they could provide their customers with temporary assignment of allocation to pump from a backup well in the event of a declared system interruption. Such a process might alleviate some of those applicants' concerns, the ag applicants have asked for variance. So we're pursuing those discussions. So the next steps are that we're continuing our evaluation, ongoing communications with the applicants to finish processing the applications. As I mentioned, we'll continue those discussions with Pleasant Valley United about how that process for temporary allocation assignment might work. Temporary allocation is specifically called out as something that can be done in the ordinance. We're putting together the applications that need to go to the Variance Review Committee. We scheduled the first meeting of the Variance Review Committee on April 6th. We expect that there may be several Variance Review Committee meetings due to the volume of applications. And staff anticipates that we'll complete processing majority of these applications by June 30th. So that completes my report, and staff recommends that you receive and file this report, and I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
Any questions or comments from the board?
I do have a question.
Yes.
Thank you. Can you say if those meetings or hearings about the variance application are public?
Yes, there will be public meetings. We anticipate there'll be Zoom meetings.
I'd be interested in observing. So you'll let us know how to do that.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank
Keely
you.
will send out an announcement.
Thank you.
I have a question, Chair.
Yes, by all means.
Kim, on the non-reported extractions, either under 5 years or over 5 years, they're not asking for specific amounts. How does that work?
Well, some are asking for specific amounts, Director Mobley, but we're still going through those. We have to work to confirm that the extractions actually did occur, try to identify what they were to the best of the ability of the information, make sure that there isn't an ask for allocation when water was being received by another pumper, which would be a double counting of that pumping. And so we're continuing to work those details on each of those. And each one's somewhat unique to go through the history. So that's why we did not have, at this time, we don't have a estimate of what the total would be.
Okay, that's why it's not on your chart, listing thing. There's just too many unknowns. So, okay, I understand.
Kim, do you anticipate that the more routine applications or those where it's pretty straightforward, perhaps they're looking for just a change in the divisor if they've got, say, 5 or more years, but they don't have the entire 10, and they're asking just to have an average of that pumping. Are those going to be dispensed with first or quicker, or are you going to wait and do it all at once, or what's your process?
No, we will work on the more straightforward ones first. Those many of those are more straightforward, so we'll move forward with those. There are considerable fees that will be due to bring those into compliance. So we're working that process, but no, we're not waiting to do it all at once, Director Borchard.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the board at this time before we open it up to the public?
I'll have comments, but perhaps later, Mr. Chair, after we hear from the public.
All right, are there any, let's open it up then to the public. Anyone wishing to comment or be heard, please raise your hand. By all means, by the way, the purpose here is to receive a status report on the processing of the variance applications. It's not to get into the details of discussion of any particular variance request. So as long as we stay on topic, we should be just fine. But with that, Brian, I see your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair West. I would just like to ask that the board and staff, if you haven't already, consider collaborating with United Water on the subset of requests that have to do with unreported pumping or underreported pumping. In terms of the fees, getting caught up on United and making sure that folks have paid their fair share for Freeman diversion and operations of the recharge, I think is really important. And I think needs to be part of any granting of allocation for unreported or underreported pumping. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Perello.
Well, Chair, Bert Perello, alternate for the amendment. I'd like to, the city of Oxnard has a pending variance request seeking flexibility to take additional groundwater in years when deliveries from Cayegas Municipal Water District are decreased. All Oxnard is asking that its supplemental water from Cayegas be treated the same way under the allocation ordinance as Pleasant Valley's water from the Conejo Creek project.
Bert, let me cut you off a second. Did you hear me explain that we are not
Yes, I did.
open
Yes, I
to
did.
discussion about individual variance requests? And did you understand that instruction?
Yes.
Okay, what are we talking about then?
I'd still like to read the statement if I can, Chair.
And the statement speaks to the process or speaks to the variance request?
Speaks to the process.
To that extent, you can read it. If it speaks to the variance request, I'll call it out of order.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. In discussing other, which is a bullet point number 3 on page 2 of the staff report, variance requests, the staff report makes statements that may be interpreted to apply to all requests for that category. These statements are not accurate. However, as applied to Oxnard's variance request, the staff report, the same bullet point 3 on page 2 of the staff report, states, quote, granting such additional allocation would affect the percentage of total sustainable yield of the allocations of the other extractors in the basin, end quote. We do not understand the GMA staff reduced allocations for other extractors because of the Conejo Creek water deliveries addition to Pleasant Valley's allocation.
All right, we are way outside of process. Now we're talking about a particular variance request. If you've got a point to make about the process, please do. Otherwise, move on.
The staff report also states that granting of variances, page 4, staff report, first paragraph, for additional extraction allocations would be additional demand on the limited yield of the groundwater resources in the basin, end quote. That is not how the Conejo Creek deliveries were treated. So there is no reason to treat the city's Cayegas deliveries differently. Page 4, staff report, paragraph 2. The staff report says that, quote, these requests are for new water that are not extracted during the base period, end quote. This reasoning does not apply to conjunctive use programs like the Conejo project, and it was not applied to calculate Pleasant Valley's allocation. It also does not apply to Oxnard's conjunctive use of Cayegas water, and so it should not be applied in describing our variance application. Thank you, Chair.
Any other questions or comments from the members of the public with respect to the processing of variance applications?
None seen, Chair.
Hearing none, we will return to the board. Any questions or comments by members of the board?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a, and you can be assured that it is a process point. My principal concern from a process standpoint is that I have certainly heard some, and probably all of us have, some apprehension regarding the length of time that it's taken for this effort to get underway. And that's no criticism of staff. Everyone's extremely busy. But I also, on the other side of the coin, understand the need for folks to be able to plan going forward. So I really would encourage, Kim, thank you for your presentation, and I would really encourage the staff to move forward expeditiously because this is going to take some time. It's not just the volume, at least in my uneducated view. It's not just the volume of requests that have been received for variances, it's the complexity of the circumstances. And if you'll forgive the expression, I think the Variance Review Committee is going to have to really go down into the weeds on some of these issues. And so inevitably, there are going to have to be a lot of questions to sled through. So I guess I would just simply leave it that I speaking for myself, would encourage staff and the committee to move forward as expeditiously as possible in this effort, because I do think it's going to take some time. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the board? Well, there's no action required on this item. We're simply to receive the presentation that we have received. With that, we will move on then to item number 7. It's an ordinance to exempt domestic operators from AMI requirements.
Good afternoon, Chair West, staff to the GMA. This item is an ordinance to exempt domestic operators from the Advanced Metering Infrastructure Ordinance. Next slide. So the agency has an ordinance requiring meters on extraction facilities, and in 2018, your board adopted an ordinance to require advanced metering infrastructure on those flow meters, and that ordinance exempted domestic wells. Here is the rollout of the effective date of that ordinance, and allowed some additional time for good cause if somebody couldn't get an AMI installed, and alternative compliance if it was impossible or impractical, essentially if there was no cell reception or other technical issue. Next slide. So the AMI ordinance only applies when a meter is required, and while domestic extraction facilities are exempt, meters are required on some domestic wells. 83 domestic wells are required to have meters, and of those, 61% report less than 2 acre-feet per year. 15 typically report extractions between 2 and 5, and 7 more than 5. And the total reported extractions average 350 acre-feet per year, which is approximately 0.3% of all reported extractions. Next slide, please. Thank you. Before your board today is an ordinance to exempt the domestic extraction facilities under certain conditions. Flat-out exemptions for facilities with a pump, discharge pipe, and flow meter diameter of 2 inches or less, and a pump motor of 10 horsepower or less, and reported annual extractions of 2 acre-feet per year or less. Next slide, thank you. In addition, the proposed ordinance allows the executive officer to exempt a domestic flow meter from AMI requirements. It must be classified as a domestic well, but it can be used for an office or restroom, office with a restroom and kitchen, not designated as a regulated small water system, or up to 4 residences connected to the well, but again, not designated as a small water system. And the well cannot be used for income-producing purposes. Included in this is the pump discharge pipe and flow meter must be a diameter of 4 inches or less, pump motor of 15 horsepower or less, and the annual extractions of 5 acre-feet or less. And since this is the executive officer's conditional exemption, the operator must be in good standing. So staff recommendation today is to receive and file this report and adopt the ordinance to exempt domestic operators from the Advanced Metering Infrastructure Ordinance. I'm available to answer any questions.
Arnie, let me start with the most basic question. Why are we considering this at all?
AMI is fairly costly, and it also comes with a monthly fee. It's essentially a communication from the wellhead to a computer system, and a domestic operator, a domestic extraction facility, just servicing a simple house, it's a burdensome expense. And we've become aware of that and see a need for these exemptions.
Did the domestic operators qualify for the rebate program that the agency instituted?
No, when the AMI was rolled out, that was for agricultural operators only. It was funded through NRCS agricultural program.
Thank you.
Arnie, I can understand. It seems we're concerned with the pumping from these domestic wells. Why do we care the size of the pump or the discharge piping? I mean, I could see a situation where an older system was in place that maybe doesn't meet those equipment requirements. As long as we should be concerned with the pumping, it seems.
The idea was if there was a potential to extract a large amount of water, that AMI should still be required. If it's a smaller system that really can't extract large volumes of water, then the exemptions apply.
I see. Okay.
Any other questions or comments from the board before we open it up to the public?
I do have a question.
Of course.
Thank you very much. What would be the process of, is there an inspection that's done? Is it like on an annual basis, or just if someone calls in and says, I think so-and-so is pumping too much? Or is it just the honor system?
Our records have the pump sizes and the meter sizes, and the annual reporting is still required. So the reports would let us know if they're over the thresholds of acre feet per year.
Is it self?
So it's honor system.
Honor system. And we know, the agency knows where all the wells are, right? We think?
Right. We do have a database of all the wells that were registered with the agency.
Just curious if possible there are unregistered wells. Probably, sure.
I'll say it's possible, but we are not aware of any. Otherwise, they'd be registered.
Thank you.
Arnie, this ties into Director Ramirez's question. But at one time, we were running down and tracking down unregistered wells. That was a compliance issue many years ago that was underway. Has that been finished? And are we confident we've gotten through all that work?
I don't have an update for you today on that. I can get back to you with that information.
This is Jeff, Director Borchard. My recollection was that was the county's, the county has a well ordinance which requires the registration of wells and tracking wells, and we did finish that under the county. I don't remember the GMA telling. The GMA issue was more about trying to figure out who had meters and didn't have meters, as I recollect. And we finished that process.
And I think there was also just some not being registered with GMA, so not having COM codes and being in the database.
I'm sorry, I missed that question.
I said I seem to recall some of them not being registered with the GMA, so therefore not being in the database.
That's quite possible. I don't remember that particularly, but that is quite possible. But as far as I know, everything's been reconciled to the best of our ability. There's still some wells out there that we can't find and we aren't sure have been abandoned properly. I know that is an open hole in the database. But as far as we know, all active wells are registered, and the GMA wells are more particularly, we use that database to fill the GMA database, the county's well database to fill the GMA database.
Because as you recall, when you took over as XO, we had to do a lot of cleanup in that regard. And it seems like one of the obvious ones would be that our records reconcile with the county well records.
That's correct. We did have a lot of cleanup and we did have a lot of reconciliation. So the crew you're talking to now are all very new. I'm going to have to go back before these guys arrive to see where that we concluded, and I'll get back to you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Any other questions or comments from the board before we open it up to the public? If there are none at this time, we'll convene a public hearing and invite members of the public who wish to be heard on this proposed ordinance to raise their hand to be recognized.
None seen, Chair.
Okay, well, with that, we will return to the board and invite any other questions or comments, or a motion then to adopt the ordinance and find that the ordinance is exempt from CEQA as outlined in the board packet.
I move the staff recommendation.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Tremblay, second.
And a roll call?
Chair West,
Yes.
Director Ramirez,
Yes.
Director Mobley,
Yes.
Director Tremblay,
Yes.
Director Borchert.
Yes.
Thank you. With that, we will recess the general session and proceed into closed session to return, hopefully in the near future. With that, thank you, and we will see you soon. Hopefully in person one of these days. As returned to general session from closed session, we can report there was no action taken in closed session that requires reporting. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you, Chair.
Bye.